RE3 has come too.
In the near past, during a dragged-out console war, shooters have become routine. The prior generation was dominated by gritty modern military shooters, or gritty sci-fi military shooters. All of this a result of everyone and their grandmothers trying to ride off of the success of Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare, released in 2007. Brown and bloom aesthetics, lumberingly slow movement, aim down sights, cover shooting, strawberry jelly on the screen, leveling mechanics that are really just for show, and much more were the defining trademarks of FPSs of that time. And while there were plenty that were very good, it was clear that by 2010, 5 years into the console generation, the market was becoming a little too saturated, with plenty of gamers either becoming frustrated and or completely dismissive of the genre.
Bloody scream! So real!
People were begging for something to come in and completely shake things up, and it came from the most unlikeliest of places.
Vanquish.
Vanquish is the fourth title developed by PlatinumGames, a then newly formed Japanese independent studio founded by ex-Capcom developers Atsushi Inaba, Shinji Mikami, Hideki Kamiya, and Tetsuya Minami. Shinji Mikami, director and producer for the Resident Evil series up to 4, was the director for Vanquish, and the game in many ways is a culmination of his work in the genre up to that point. But to better understand Vanquish, I think it's important to look back and see how he got to this point.
PN3.
Product number 03, or PN3, was the first game released as a part of the Capcom 5, a collaboration between Nintendo and Capcom, with the latter providing 5 exclusive titles for the GameCube, the other 4 being Beautiful Joe, Dead Phoenix, which was cancelled, Killer 7, and Resident Evil 4. While Mikami oversaw and spearheaded the initiative, he only directed 2 out of 5 of the games, PN3 and RE4. While the others either broke ground or found their niche, PN3 kind of got forgotten, and after playing it, it's pretty easy to see why. PN3 is a third-person shooter with an emphasis on arcade-style gameplay, but it doesn't do either quite well. For starters, you can't move while shooting, nor can you aim while shooting. In fact, there's no actual camera control at all. The C-stick is used only for adjusting the camera angles slightly. This makes controlling Vanessa, the protagonist, a very frustrating experience as you spend more time battling with the stiff mechanics than you do with the enemies on screen. The concept for the game kinda hooked me in. On paper, it sounded like Devil May Cry meets Perfect Dark, but the bitter and cold reality is that it's a poor man's version of both. And through my short time playing the game, I can never shake the feeling that it was always meant to be more than what we got. Which brings me to another point. Looking at interviews with Mikami, it's very clear why PN3 turned out like this. It had its development time cut short to 6 months at the 11th hour due to Capcom needing something released quickly to meet yearly sales goals. As a result, many concepts the team wanted, like giving Vanessa a gun, was scrapped entirely. It's hard to say how good the game would have been if Mikami and his team had enough time to flesh it out and polish everything, but the suddenly short deadline didn't do many favors and only contributed more to the game's lukewarm reception and poor sales. But that was in the past, as 2 years later Mikami would lead his team to create the final version of Resident Evil 4, which not only reinvigorated the franchise in the survival horror genre, but created the defining mechanics of the modern third-person shooter, over-the-shoulder cameras and laser sight aiming. RE4 would go on to sell millions of copies and be ported to millions of other gaming systems, but friction behind the scenes between Mikami and Capcom would result in the former leaving the company that he built his career at.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
Shooters have traditionally been a Western thing, as most games in the genre are made by Westerners and for the Western market. This isn't to say that other countries don't make shooters. After all, the biggest FPS of last year around the world wasn't Call of Duty or Battlefield, but rather PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, and that was developed by a South Korean studio. But even in the case of PUBG, the game is remarkably more Western in its look and gameplay compared to other Korean games like Guns the Duel. And this can be easily explained by the fact that the creative director for PUBG, PlayerUnknown himself, Brendan Green, is a native of Ireland and has worked on mods for other Western shooters in the past. In contrast, Vanquish's development team, with the exception of JB Killams, the writer, was all Japanese, and thus the game has a very unique Japanese flair to it despite its influences. In the near future, San Francisco is destroyed by a giant laser, and a terrorist group known as the Order of the Russian Star claims responsibility and threatens the United States government with an ultimatum.
Your complete and unconditional surrender.
Americans, being what we are, refuse to surrender and go to full-scale war with the Russian Star in space. Enter our hero, Sam Gideon. Sam, a former football player, is a soldier working for DARPA and is their guinea pig for their experimental augmented reactor suit and battlefield logic adaptable electronic weapon system, or R as in Blade for short. Sam and his cohort Elena are sent into war to fight alongside the US Marines to not only test the suit, but to also rescue their boss, Dr. Candide, and to find out the traitor among them.
The American government has been betrayed by one of its own. You two are the only ones I can trust with this information. The Russian military is planning on using the microwave energy array to attack the US. As its designer, I cannot abide this misuse for such a heinous purpose. You know what must be done.
For this review, I decided to play the PC version of the game, and as someone who originally bought the game years ago on 360, I really can't praise Sega enough for their work in porting the game over to Steam. Vanquish on 360 and PS3 was a fine experience, but it was very obvious that the hardware was holding the game back. But with the PC port, it throws out all of those problems, and instead we get a super fast and smooth unlocked frame rate, increased texture quality, support for higher resolutions, keyboard and mouse controls, with support for keyboard aiming. Yes, you heard that right. Aiming with the keyboard, like it's 1994. I recommend watching Digital Foundry's video on the PC port if you want a more in-depth analysis and comparison. Vanquish plays out like most third-person shooters of the time, but has a few extra mechanics to make the experience more exciting. The boost mechanics, the slow-mo, and melee. Instead of moving from cover to cover and staying behind the safety of a wall, the game encourages you to be on the offensive at all times. While the game still allows you to play it like a traditional cover shooter, not only does doing so make the game a lot more boring, but on higher difficulties and during boss fights, the game gets a lot more aggressive, and you'll eventually have no choice but to break out of your comfort zone. This is my third playthrough of Vanquish, but the first time I played the game on hard, and boy is it hard. A lot of shooters think making something hard means giving enemies a lot more health, which leads to a lot of tedious and boring combat, instead of something truly challenging. But luckily, I can safely say that Vanquish's hard mode doesn't make that mistake, as goons aren't just bullet sponges, but instead act more aggressive and hit a lot harder. Vanquish is split into 5 acts, each with a handful of missions in them. Like most modern shooters, every mission is very linear with no branching paths or backtracking. Most missions never feel like they're overstaying their welcome, and the pacing of the acts do a good job of breaking up the monotony of running and gunning all the time. A great example of this is Act 2. You spend the entire game fighting what feels like an uphill battle, only to literally do that later in the act. I wouldn't say it's the hardest part of the game, but it was one of the few parts of the game to make me truly feel overwhelmed and outgunned. There were also other moments through the game that I really liked as well, such as one with a crumbling highway, another where you must ride a monorail at night and avoid being spotted, and another where you have to sneak inside a battleship by yourself. The boss fights are okay. Bosses in other Platinum games really go the extra mile in terms of feeling exciting to play, but here in Vanquish they feel a little half-baked in comparison. And the only two that left an impression on me were Unknown and the final bogeys. Everything else was just and the fact that you face off against the Argus not once, not twice, but 4 times seems to show to me that they were really running out of ideas. However, bosses in other shooters were always a mixed bag for me, so I feel like I can't rag on the game too much. Like most Platinum games, Vanquish is mechanically straightforward enough to pick up and understand regardless of your skill level, but offers enough depth to keep combat exciting and fresh for players wanting more. Things like shooting grenades mid-air, speeding up reloading by switching to weapons quickly, shooting the pilots of transports to blow them up, and combining dashing with melee attacks are some extra strategies the game doesn't directly explain to you, but is there to allow you to go outside of just shooting things, and I believe that this is what truly sets Vanquish apart from other games in the genre at the time. Going back to PN3, it starts becoming really obvious where the general idea of Vanquish came from. Both are sci-fi shooters, both have the attractive protagonists and white power suits, both allow you to do acrobatics, so on and so forth. But Vanquish feels far closer to the game PN3 was trying to be from the get-go, and with the better technology and creative freedom, Mikami was able to create a better successor and mostly realize his vision. I say mostly because, like with any game, there's always going to be content that didn't make the final cut. Things like sticky grenades, miniguns, a motorbike, a robot support dog, and an acoustic guitar? The story and characters of Vanquish are pretty bare bones. I was never expecting an incredibly deep political thriller or whatever, but at the same time I never felt super invested in the characters in the story. People like Dr. Candide and Zaitsev don't get enough screen time, and the ones that do, like Elena and Sam, don't feel interesting enough to carry the story, and come across more as proxies for the player to self-insert into, rather than being their own thing. It certainly doesn't help that most of the exposition and background information for everyone are told through the loading screens, which I barely get to read due to how fast loading is in the PC port. The only character that I felt really stood out and had any sort of progression through the game was Captain Burns. Even though he's kind of a stereotypical hard-ass soldier man TM, he was an absolute blast to be around, and every line that comes out of his mouth is great.
Come on, you ain't. You wanna live forever? What the hell is that thing? I hate surprises.
Do not fall under military jurisdiction, Lieutenant Colonel.
I think what you're trying to say is fuck off.
They're jamming the control interfaces. You can't hack in until you get rid of those RRs.
Funny. We were gonna get rid of them anyway.
What the fuck, man?
You're not allowed to smoke on the ship.
Every feature in Vanquish feels like it was designed with a lot of thought and care, except for one thing: the upgrade system. So, in Vanquish you can upgrade your weapons to make them more powerful, carry more ammo, etc, etc. But unlike other action games where you use a separate object like in-game currency or a rare item, to improve equipment in Vanquish, upgrading is done usually just by grabbing the same weapon that you already have in the game world. So if you want to upgrade your assault rifle, you just pick up another one. This sounds like an easy process, but there's a big catch. This only works if your gun is fully loaded. Otherwise, it'll just replenish your ammo instead of upgrading. In addition, weapon availability is a bit random, for lack of a better term. Since enemies don't drop guns or ammo like in other third-person shooters, you can only pick them up from crates and small locker things scattered across the game. So there'll be many times where you'll be on the lookout for a specific weapon, only to find something that you don't want. Despite the game having 12 weapons, there were only 3 that I ever stuck with: the assault rifle, the heavy machine gun, and the shotgun. Due to the upgrade system, by the time I got to Act 2, barely the midway point of the game, I was already so invested in the loadout that I had that I struggled to find reasons to use any other gun unless the situation really demanded it, like the monorail stealth sequence. Keeping upgrades is also a bit annoying because if you die and use the checkpoint, your weapons get downgraded a level, so to avoid that, you'll have to instead hit restart and do the whole mission again. I don't really think that this system adds anything to the experience, and probably would have been better if it was completely redesigned or omitted entirely. Unfortunately, there's not much else to do with Vanquish aside from the main campaign and a few challenge missions, which are just repurposed missions from the campaign. There's no multiplayer, no extra story DLC, no other challenge modes, nada. For $20 on Steam, this isn't really a huge issue. In fact, it's actually a pretty good deal. However, I did pay a little bit more for this back in the day, and even then I felt a little disappointed. It also doesn't really help that the game ends on a slight cliffhanger with Zaitsev getting away in the final climax. In the end, Vanquish never became a huge, massive mega hit, but it did find an audience here in the West, and positive word of mouth only helped people become more aware of it and Platinum over time. When you think about it, Vanquish's design isn't really that original. Max Payne had slow-mo action back in 2001, plenty of shooters let you punch and kick people in the face, and lightning-fast movement was a staple of PC FPSs of the 90s. But Vanquish succeeds not necessarily by being original, but by taking what already existed and building off of it. Whether it was intended or not, I feel the game is a callback to what shooters used to be, and while it's hard to say how much impact Vanquish had, there's certainly been a number of shooters made this generation that put mobility and offensive action front and center. Games like Titanfall 1 and 2, Doom 2016, the Wolfenstein games, and Superhot are some examples that come to mind. There have been rumors and murmurings about a sequel for a long time, but I'm not sure if it'll ever happen, or if I'd ever want that, considering Mikami is no longer at Platinum. But either way, I do hope that the success of Vanquish and games like it continue to send a message to developers here in America about what people really want from their shooters.